there is a new book from Peter Fiekowsky, and it's about climate restoration. In fact, it's called Climate Restoration, and it's about returning this planet toward the kind of CO2 levels that would sustain life. Because to do that, you'll need to do some kind of sequestration of the CO2 that's out there. Well, Peter Fiekowsky has ideas on how to do that, and he has them in the book Climate Restoration, and he joins us now. Peter Fiekowsky, everybody. Hi, Peter.
Hi. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, very exciting to talk to you because this is something of a revolutionary notion. It's clear that we're not going to be able to reduce things to the levels that they need to be reduced. I'm talking about greenhouse gases to the levels that were agreed upon, for example, in the Paris Climate Accords. So when I see things of the sort that you're suggesting, I think, well, maybe that's the answer. That is to say, some sort of carbon sequestration. Can you describe those goals that you would have and how we might get there?
Yeah. Well, the goals are the fundamental part because the book and the message is really the first good news about the climate. And good news is news that we're going where we want to go. And where we want to go in the climate, if you think about it, if you think in your heart, you think, oh, I want the climate to be back the way it was 100, 200 years ago. And what's interesting and what the book is about is that if you make that specific goal and getting CO2 back to what it was 100 or 200 years ago, then it turns out we actually know how to do that. We've known how to do it for many, many decades. And the problem has simply been that our goals are based on what the goals needed to be back in 1970 when we needed to stop emitting. Well, a lot of water has gone under the bridge. CO2 levels are now 50% higher than humans have ever survived before. So just reducing emissions won't reduce the CO2 levels back to survivable levels.
So what are your strategies that you would suggest employing to try to return those levels to what they might have been 100 or 200 years ago?
It's the same method that nature has used over the eons. You and the audience probably are familiar with ice ages that happen every 100,000 years or so. And leading to ice ages, the planet cools down because CO2 levels go down. And nature takes that CO2 and puts it in the ocean in the form of carbon. So the same way trees absorb carbon from the air and store it in the wood, sea life sinks that carbon down into depths where it doesn't rot. Because we all know that when trees die, they rot, and then the CO2 goes back into the air. In the ocean, that doesn't happen. And of course, the ocean is 3/4 of the surface of our planet, so there's lots of area for it. So the main methods duplicate how nature sequesters CO2 in the ocean. One is
so you'd stimulate the growth of like algae and those things in the ocean that would help in this overall effort to sequester all of this CO2. Yeah.
Exactly. So what nature does, the way nature fosters the algae growth is with very small amounts of iron dust. And there are other ways, but that's the really efficient way. And the algae grows, it feeds fish, and the dead fish and the dead algae eventually sink down to the bottom of the ocean. And the great thing about this method is the fish now become profitable for fisheries, both native fisheries as well as commercial fisheries. And so it's a self-financing approach. And so it's hard.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. It's hardly a try. It's really more of let's just go ahead and do it. It was tested in Alaska about 10 years ago. It wasn't documented well for a lot of political reasons. But I've talked with the people who worked on it, and they said that was amazing. If you look in the history books, in the records of fisheries, the pink salmon catch went up fivefold the year after they did the test in Alaska because there was so much food for the salmon.
Peter Fiekowsky is our guest. Climate Restoration is the new book, and it is revolutionary in the sense that he's suggesting that you can't get to where we need to be with existing policy. So you need to find some kind of CO2 sequestration that might have to do with the oceans, is what he's suggesting, because that's the biggest sink for CO2. And by stimulating the growth of some of these things in the ocean, you can actually improve dramatically, is what you're suggesting, the CO2 removal from the atmosphere.
Yes. We can't. When nature sequesters CO2 in the ocean, like during an ice age, the amount of carbon in the ocean goes up less than 2%. So it's not a big deal for the ecosystem of the ocean. I mean, everything's a big deal, but 2%. By comparison, if we tried to grow enough trees to sequester the carbon, we'd have to double the carbon in our land ecosystem, and that's a big ecosystem change. I don't think we want to really.
Yeah, that's ridiculous. It's not going to happen. Well, I mean, it's sadly we're not even planting trees. We're cutting trees down. We're clear cutting forests around the world. What are the political obstacles to this, Peter?
There's really not. The politics in it isn't in the government. The politics is fear on financiers and science. So when this was done 10 years ago, the environmental community said, no, wait a minute, this is interesting, but I think there's a problem here. The community said, the United Nations tells us that we need to reduce emissions. And if you pull all this carbon out of the atmosphere, that just gives us all license to emit more carbon rather than emit less, because they didn't understand that the problem isn't the emission of carbon, it's actually the level of carbon in the atmosphere. But that's 10 years ago. Everything's changed. And I think everyone now understands that the climate problem is the level of CO2. And everyone is, although people still have scar tissue from the horrible attacks that were made 10 years ago, people are getting over it fairly rapidly now. And so the scientific community and the financing community are all getting very interested. I know scientists and a group of 50 university scientists have begun working on it this year, and a bunch of financiers. And I'm going to be going on Earth Day to a conference of financiers who are interested in it. So
Peter Fiekowsky, let me in our last minute or so, I want to ask you about sort of the law of unintended consequences, which I always worry, we start screwing with nature. Well, now, and even as I say this, I want to make it clear, I'm aware of what we're screwing with nature now. Okay, I mean, yes. The tonnage of CO2 that is being blasted into the atmosphere, and the toxins that are part of we bathe in them, and our lungs are taking them in all the time, not to mention the effects on the planet. I understand we're screwing with it already. Do you worry, though, that any of this stuff that you have gamed out with the recharging of the ocean and making that this huge place for sequestration of CO2, do you worry that any of that may start a domino effect that could be problematic?
Well, it will definitely start a domino effect, but all the evidence is that it will be good. And so as you replenish the ocean, the fish will grow. The Cape cod is named after cod, and there's no cod left. But when you do this, you can bring the cod back. We can bring the salmon back. The salmon season, I think, is like 1.5 weeks this year, something like that. And so bring that back. The whales are down 99% from what they were 200 years ago. And the whales did a lot of the fertilizing of bringing iron back to the surface. Well, by bringing the iron to the surface, there's now food. There will be food for whales again. When they did this 10 years ago, they discovered there was a bulge of whale births 3 or 4 years later, because the gestation period is about 2.5 years for whales.
It seems extraordinary, Peter. I mean, what you're talking about is revolutionary, and yet it seems so doable. Peter Fiekowsky is an MIT-educated physicist and engineer. He's worked at NASA, taught at MIT. I mean, this is a guy with real cred. And you yourself are an entrepreneur and philanthropist, and you're going to need buy-in from the entrepreneurial community to, I would imagine, to underwrite some of this. But it's all laid out in Climate Restoration, which is the new book, Climate Restoration. And there's a link on my Twitter feed as well. Peter, it's intriguing, it's fascinating, and you actually create hope in me, and I have a pretty dim view of the future.
I'm so glad. You made my day right there. Once you can see where you want to go, getting there isn't that difficult. The trick is to get from the abstraction, I want to go to a good place, to I want to get back to the climate where we were. And once you get
you have to get beyond the I wanna, and you have to get to the how to, and that's what you have here.
Yeah.
I think it's a practical strategy. Peter Fiekowsky, good luck with Climate Restoration, the book, and stay in touch, Peter Fiekowsky. Appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for the time.
Okay, my friend. Yeah, I mean he's a big brain cat, and that's a smart way to. We are, when it comes to climate, and when it comes to the planet, we're at the break the glass and pull the lever moment. We really are. And so it can't just be business as usual, just plain and simple. So some of these innovative and revolutionary notions are going to have to be integrated.